Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Yucca Digital Network. I'm so glad you're here for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be tackling a question that's super relevant for all of us, especially if you're in high school or university, navigating a world just overflowing with information. How do we know if something is actually true? What makes something scientific?
Yeah, it's like having a superpower. That ability to sift through all the noise and figure out what's reliable.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to explore today. We've got a stack of sources that break down the different ways we learn and how the scientific method helps us get closer to the truth. So before we jump in, think about something you believe in, something you hold to be true. Got it. Now ask yourself, where did that belief come from? How do you know it's true? Keep that in mind as we go because it gets really interesting.
Absolutely. We're going to kind of unpack the different ways we acquire knowledge, and you might be surprised to realize how often we rely on certain methods without even realizing it.
Okay, let's dive in. Our sources lay out four main ways we acquire knowledge: authority, personal experience, rationalism, and empiricism. Authority, this one's pretty familiar. We believe things because someone we trust told us they were true. Parents, teachers, textbooks, doctors, you name it.
Think about how much we rely on authority every single day. It makes sense. We can't be experts in everything, so we trust those who are. But here's the catch. Even authorities can be wrong.
Oh, I can definitely relate to that. I remember when I was younger, my parents told me that cracking my knuckles would give me arthritis. For years, I avoided it like the plague. Turns out it's just a myth.
Exactly. And sometimes the stakes are much higher than sore knuckles. Take the case of Trofim Lysenko, a Soviet geneticist. His ideas about genetics were completely off base. But because he had the backing of the government, his theories were enforced as absolute truth.
Wait, so even if scientists disagree, the government can just decide what's true. That's kind of scary.
It is. And in Lysenko's case, it had devastating consequences. Scientists who dared to challenge him were silenced, and agricultural practices based on his flawed theories led to widespread crop failures.
So the takeaway here is, don't blindly trust authority. Always ask, what's the evidence?
Exactly. Now let's move on to personal experience. This is about what we observe and what happens to us directly. It feels very real and convincing because it's our experience.
Yeah, personal experience can be super powerful. Like, I'm convinced that pineapple on pizza is delicious because I've tried it and loved it. But I know other people feel very differently.
That's a perfect example. Just because something is true for you doesn't mean it's universally true. We can fall into the trap of overgeneralizing from limited personal experience.
So, like, if you have one bad encounter with a cat, you might conclude that all cats are mean, even though that's not necessarily true.
Exactly. And those overgeneralizations can be harmful, especially when they lead to prejudice and stereotypes.
Okay, I'm seeing a pattern here. Each way of knowing has its strengths and weaknesses. What about rationalism? Isn't logic always reliable?
Well, rationalism is all about using logic and reasoning to reach conclusions. It's essential for problem solving, forming hypotheses, and constructing arguments, but it's only as good as the premises it's built on.
So you're saying even if the logic is perfect, if you start with a false assumption, you'll end up with a wrong conclusion.
Precisely. Imagine someone believes that left-handed people are more creative. They might then logically conclude that a design company should only hire left-handed employees.
Wow, okay, I see how that could get messy. So logic needs to be paired with accurate information to be truly effective. All right, let's move on to our last way of knowing, empiricism. This one feels like it's all about getting your hands dirty, right?
You could say that. Empiricism is the foundation of science because it emphasizes observation and experimentation. It's about going beyond our own opinions and biases and actually gathering evidence.
So instead of just saying, I think this is true, you'd actually design a study, collect data, and analyze the results.
Exactly. It's like being a detective gathering clues and using tools to put the pieces together.
That's a great analogy. But even detectives can be fooled, right?
Absolutely. That's why science has developed a system, the scientific method, to minimize those chances of being fooled by our own biases or faulty observations.
Okay, now we're talking. Now that we've got this foundation of how we learn, let's see how science puts it all together in a powerful system. Are you ready to dive into the scientific method?
Absolutely. The scientific method is like a roadmap. It helps us navigate the world of knowledge in a reliable way.
All right, so what are we trying to achieve with this roadmap? What's the destination?
Ultimately, science aims to explain the universe around us. We do that by building theories, systems of ideas that connect the dots between observations, and help us understand why things happen.
So it's not just about collecting a bunch of facts, it's about understanding the bigger picture.
That's right. And along the way, we're also looking to predict and control phenomena,
Yeah.
which can have a huge impact on our lives.
Okay, I see where you're going with this. Like, if we can predict earthquakes, we could save lives. Or if we understand how the brain works, maybe we could develop better treatments for mental health conditions.
Exactly. Those are just a few examples of how powerful scientific understanding can be. But to get there, we need to follow the steps of the scientific method. It all starts with the empirical referent.
Empirical referent. That sounds a bit intimidating.
Don't worry, it's simpler than it sounds.
Th-
It just means that whatever we're studying has to be observable and measurable in some way. We need to be able to gather data, whether it's through our senses or with the help of instruments.
So we can't just study things that exist in our imaginations.
Right.
Like we couldn't do a scientific study on unicorns.
Well, not unless we found some real-life unicorns to observe. Science deals with the world we can actually interact with.
Okay, that makes sense. What about repeatability? Does that mean scientists are just doing the same experiments over and over again?
Not exactly. Repeatability means that the findings of a study should be reproducible by other scientists using the same methods. It's like a quality control check.
So if I claim to have invented a potion that makes you fly, other scientists should be able to follow my recipe and get the same result.
Exactly. If they can't, then there's probably something wrong with my potion or my methods.
Okay, I'm starting to see why repeatability is so important. It helps ensure that scientific findings are reliable, not just flukes. What about self-correction? Doesn't that imply that scientists are always getting things wrong?
Well, science isn't about being right or wrong. It's about getting closer to the truth. And that truth can evolve as new evidence emerges.
So it's like a continuous process of updating and refining our understanding.
Exactly. Think about how our understanding of the solar system has changed over time. We used to believe that the Earth was the center of the universe. Then Copernicus came along and proposed a heliocentric model with the sun at the center. And later we discovered that our solar system is just one of billions in the Milky Way galaxy.
Wow, that's a pretty major shift in perspective. So science is always open to revision and new discoveries.
Absolutely. That's what makes it so powerful. It's not about clinging to old ideas. It's about embracing new evidence and constantly seeking a more accurate picture of reality.
Okay, I'm really starting to appreciate the flexibility of the scientific method. What about systematic investigation? That sounds pretty intense.
It's all about being careful and intentional in our observations and experiments. We want to minimize bias and error as much as possible.
So it's not just about randomly observing things and hoping for the best.
Definitely not. It's about designing experiments with clear controls, using precise measurements and analyzing data objectively. Remember that story about the cockroach losing its legs?
Oh, yeah. The researcher concluded that the cockroach was deaf because it stopped jumping after its legs were removed.
Right. That was a classic example of confusing observation with inference. The researcher observed the lack of jumping, but incorrectly inferred that the cockroach couldn't hear.
It's like jumping to conclusions. So systematic investigation helps us avoid those pitfalls and be more rigorous in our observations.
What about theory? We've mentioned it a few times, but I want to make sure I understand what it really means in a scientific context.
It's a common misconception that a theory is just a guess. In science, a theory is a well-substantiated explanation for a set of observations. It's supported by a lot of evidence and helps us make predictions.
So it's not just a random idea someone came up with?
Not at all. It's a framework that helps us organize our knowledge and make sense of the world around us.
But even with all this evidence and careful observation, scientists can still be influenced by their own biases, right?
Absolutely. Confirmation bias is a major challenge. Our brains are wired to look for evidence that supports what we already believe.
Yeah.
It's like that number series game we talked about earlier.
Oh, yeah. With the sequence 246, most people assume the rule is add 2 and only test sequences that confirm that rule.
Exactly. But to really test the theory, you need to try to disprove it by testing sequences that don't fit the add 2 rule. So instead of just looking for evidence that supports our ideas, we should actively seek out evidence that might challenge them.
Exactly. It's not easy, but it's crucial for good science. Scientists have to be willing to admit they might be wrong and be open to changing their minds based on new evidence.
That's a great reminder for all of us, not just scientists. All right, let's move on to a topic that often sparks debate: basic research. This is research that's driven by pure curiosity without any immediate practical application in mind, right?
That's right. It's about exploring the unknown just for the sake of knowledge.
I can imagine some people saying, why waste money studying something that doesn't have an obvious use? Shouldn't we focus on research that solves practical problems?
It's tempting to think that way, But history shows that basic research can lead to incredible breakthroughs. Think about the discovery of electricity. It started with scientists rubbing amber and observing static purely out of curiosity. No one imagined it would revolutionize the world.
Wow, that's a great example. So basic research is like planting seeds for the future. We might not know which ones will blossom, but we need to plant them to have any chance of a harvest.
Precisely. It's an investment in the long game of scientific discovery.
Okay, I'm convinced. Basic research is essential. Last but not least, let's talk about the difference between science and technology. I think this is an important distinction, especially when we hear people blaming scientists for the negative consequences of certain technologies.
Absolutely. It's crucial to remember that science is about seeking knowledge and understanding the world, while technology is about applying that knowledge to create tools and solve problems.
So science gives us the knowledge and technology gives us the tools, but they're not always separate, right?
Right. There's definitely a complex interplay between the two. Sometimes technological advancements drive new scientific discoveries. For example, the invention of the telescope revolutionized our understanding of astronomy.
And on the flip side, scientific discoveries can lead to new technologies. Like understanding the structure of DNA allowed us to develop genetic engineering techniques.
Exactly. It's a dynamic back and forth process. And it's important to remember that both science and technology are human endeavors. So they're subject to our values, biases, and decision making.
Which brings us to the intersection of science and public policy. This is where things get really complicated, right?
Definitely. Societal problems rarely have simple solutions. They often involve a complex web of scientific, technological, philosophical, political, and economic factors.
So even if science provides us with the knowledge and technology to address an issue like climate change, for instance, it doesn't automatically mean we'll implement those solutions.
You got it. There are always competing interests, values, and priorities to consider. And sometimes the solutions that science offers come with their own set of challenges and ethical considerations. It's like a giant puzzle with no easy answers.
Wow, this deep dive has really opened my eyes to the complexities of knowledge belief and the scientific method. What are some key takeaways our listeners should keep in mind?
Well, first and foremost, remember that knowledge is a journey, not a destination. There's always more to learn. And even our most cherished beliefs can be challenged by new evidence.
It's like that saying, the more you know, the more you realize you don't know.
Exactly. And that's not a bad thing. It's exciting to think that there's always more to discover and understand.
So what are some practical tips our listeners can take away from this deep dive? I mean, how can we be more savvy consumers of information, especially in this age of social media and instant news?
Great question. One of the most important things is to be aware of your sources. Who's providing the information and what's their agenda?
So like if I see a headline about a miracle cure on a random website, I should be skeptical.
Absolutely. Look for credible sources like reputable scientific journals, government agencies, or well-established news organizations. And don't just rely on one source. Cross-check the information with other sources to see if the story holds up.
That's a great point. And what about those times when we're presented with conflicting information? How do we decide who to believe?
That's where critical thinking comes in. Look for evidence-based arguments, not just opinions or emotional appeals, and remember that science is a process, not a collection of fixed facts.
So it's okay to question things, even if they come from experts.
Absolutely. Healthy skepticism is a key part of the scientific mindset. Ask questions, demand evidence, and don't be afraid to challenge assumptions.
I love that. Be curious, be critical, be open to new ideas. Those are great takeaways for all of us, no matter what stage of life we're in.
And remember, the scientific method isn't just for scientists and labs. It's a way of thinking that we can apply to all areas of life.
It's like a toolkit for making better decisions. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. Any final thoughts you want to leave our listeners with?
Just this. Embrace the joy of learning. The world is full of fascinating things to discover, and the more we understand about how knowledge is constructed and how science works, the more empowered we become to navigate that world with confidence and make informed choices.
Beautifully said. A huge thanks to our expert for this incredible deep dive. And to all our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on the Yaka Digital Network.
We hope you found this episode insightful and inspiring.
Don't forget to check back daily for new episodes of The Deep Dive. And if you're craving even more knowledge, visit www.yaka.cc/books, or WhatsApp us at +2567707307170 for amazing learning materials.
And be sure to share this episode with your friends, family, classmates, anyone who might benefit from this information. Let's spread the power of knowledge and critical thinking far and wide.
That's it for today's deep dive. Until next time, keep those minds curious and keep exploring.